So we'll just go ahead and get started. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today for our Valiant Voices conversation series. We are so glad you could join us. I'd like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. So at Global Rights for Women, we gratefully acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands we're on today. Even though we're meeting in a virtual space, it's important for us to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since even before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with staff throughout the state, and we acknowledge that we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that has been inflicted upon Indigenous people globally. Additionally, we understand that the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women here in Minnesota and around the world. So please join us now in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can join the effort to dismantle the oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. And also, since people are joining here from around the world, at this time, if you would like to put in the chat the land that you are acknowledging, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. I just want to say we are so grateful that you all have come to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I am Nazifa Zirzada. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be today's moderator. I'm also the program manager at Global Rights for Women, an organization with a mission to end domestic and sexual violence around the world. Valiant Voices is actually a conversation series we started that features the human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are the stories of powerful leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. I also want to let you all know that we're live streaming on Facebook today, so we welcome your comments there or here on Zoom in the chat. After the conversation, we'll be sending out a link with the recording for you all. I am so pleased and honored to introduce our panelists to you today. I'll start with Alessandra Gribaldo. She is an associate professor of cultural anthropology at Roma Tre University. Over the past 10 years, Alessandra has been involved in a number of collaborative research projects with the ethnographic analysis of contemporary Italian society, including low fertility, women's safety, and right to justice, migration, reproduction, and identity. She has recently published Unexpected Subjects, Intimate Partner Violence, Testimony, and the Law, an ethnography of the encounter between women's words and the demands of the law in the context of adjudications on intimate partner violence. We are also so grateful to be joined by Allison Murray. As she said in her bio, she didn't aspire to be a domestic violence spokesperson or advocate or victim. She's a mother of 5 and a woman who loved her husband and loved her life until something went horribly wrong in the marriage. Now, Allison is divorced and her ex-husband is serving a 20-year sentence for attempted murder. She's telling her story to help other women acknowledge to themselves when something is wrong in their relationships, to find their voices and to get help. Allison wants women to understand that no one has the right to control them or hurt them. In Melissa Scaia's position as Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women, she also brings a wealth of experience as the former Executive Director of Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs, also known as the Duluth Model. She was the Executive Director of Advocates for Family Peace for 17 years, a local domestic violence advocacy program. She has also led and organized 2 coordinated community responses to address domestic violence in Minnesota, as well as co-facilitating groups for men who batter and women who use violence. As a qualified expert in the state of Minnesota, she also testifies as an expert witness on domestic violence in criminal court cases. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'd like to take a moment to set the context for today's conversation. For every case of gender-based violence, so many cases go unreported, partly because testifying is difficult. Women face a multitude of challenges to access justice, especially related to their economic status, need for evidence, and the trauma of testifying in court. All of these things often result in lack of punishment or imputing for perpetrators and further traumatization around reporting and court proceedings. As an organization, Global Rights for Women seeks to change these dynamics and allow women to access justice. I'm so grateful for our guests today who will talk about a very pressing and nuanced topic. I'd love to start with you, Alessandra. Your book, Unexpected Subjects, is truly so enlightening and so well researched, and I think one of the few books out there really examining women's experiences within the judicial system. As you were writing it, I know you mentioned to me that you spent 1 year in the courts in Italy researching and documenting the experience of women in gender-based violence cases. What you learned is that so often the character of the woman is what was really on trial, that her decisions are questioned rather than the crime she experienced. And this was because many women feel love for their abusers, men they've been in relationships with, or are the fathers of their children. And this is often held against them as bad judgment rather than he should not be abusing. For this reason, women are considered culpable in the violence that happened to them or that they don't deserve justice. We know that this is a global problem. From your perspective, what needs to change so that women can receive the justice that they deserve?
Thank you, Nazifa, for your words, and to Valiant Voices for the invitation to this dialogue. And to answer your question, I would focus on the issue of intimacy. So there is a judgment. Women during trials on domestic violence are considered culpable, as you said, for the situation where they live and they've been experiencing, which is based on different reasons. And in my perspective, the main issue is that violence occurs within an intimate relationship, and by intimate, we mean not only affection and feelings, but also dependence. So, for example, the economic status, or the fact of having shared a part of life with the perpetrator, so the management of children. Nonetheless, if the issues related to economics and the custody of children can be more easily acknowledged and managed by the law, what remains problematic is love and intimacy itself. And this is what I mainly found during the hearings I have attended during the research. What love has got to do with it? We often hear this sentence as a sort of slogan against intimate partner violence, but we all know that love and affection has a lot to do with it. That ambivalence is very common, and the fact that being firm and perfectly consequential regarding pressing charge against the perpetrator is not common. The contrary is physiological, we might say. In the cases of testimonies of domestic violence that I have the opportunity to follow, it is evident how the lack of recognition of the victim and the underestimation of the violence do not depend simply on attribution of irrelevance or prejudice, but it has to do with the fact that the law presupposes this neutral subject, and it is this perfectly coherent, autonomous subject that the women victims fail to correspond. So I think we can try to untangle evidence, gender, and intimacy in the dynamics that certify domestic violence for a better understanding of the ways in which judges, professional advocates, and claimants aim to make it through the institutional system, and sometimes despite the institutional system. And in this sense, I believe that ethnography and social sciences more generally must necessarily try to provide instruments. And I think that to acknowledge the complexity, nuances, and negotiation does not prevent an intervention, the possibility of an intervention. So it's not a question of denouncing the impossibility of justice, but of constantly questioning the justice system. So judges, especially women judges I met, are aware of the complication. It is complicated to overcome and to resolve completely this encounter between law and women's needs. And probably it is possible it's impossible to resolve it completely, but what we can do is to try all the time to make our instrument, even legal instrument, closer to the complexity of everyday life. And this awareness should be made explicit and should be shared not only within the legal context, but in social, cultural, pedagogical context as well. So I think it's important to focus on what abused women want from the law, but it may be productive as well to understand what the law wants from women. And it would be constructive to consider the relationship between law and victims of violence as an encounter between two hesitations, we may say, two difficulties. There is, I believe here, a space for the construction of a path towards a more just system. So going back to your question, what needs to change for women to achieve the justice they deserve, very quickly. First, the importance of public debates beyond emergencies about gender violence, and it's to give women the opportunities to speak when they feel like and have the strength to do that, and the appropriate context to do that. So never judging them if they cannot or prefer not to speak, or if they speak out not in the immediate of the event. And so try to change the taken for granted social expectations regarding the victim and her testimony. So a dialogue between feminist movements, legal professionals, social scientists can be very useful. Second, it's very important to implement trainings for all professionals who deal constantly with the issue of domestic violence. Not only social workers, law enforcement, but also lawyers and magistrates. Third, last but not least, the need to give voice and money to women professionals who work in the shelters, feminist shelters. We know, they know very well how to manage very complicated cases, to give them counseling and safety. And the lawyers who work there have the chance, if given enough attention and space, to make women's rights respected during trials. So feminism as a theory and a practice, I believe, acts not as a simple solution, but as a productive tool that can make the difference. A stratified and often neglected collective history and experience and practice that can make the difference. And I stop here.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. I really appreciate your response. And I think it ties so well to what we do here at Global Rights for Women. It's so important for us to shift the focus on survivors to have to seek out justice, to rather, how can we get the entire system responding effectively and respectfully and holistically to survivors' needs. So I'd like to turn to Melissa. In addition to your work as the Director of International Training here at Global Rights for Women, you're also an expert witness, and you're called upon in cases of domestic violence. Could you explain to us a little bit more, what is the role of an expert witness, and how do you see your role in terms of addressing how the system is doing what it's supposed to?
Yeah, so I'm an expert witness in criminal cases in Minnesota. Every state has different rules about, and a lot of times state Supreme Court cases about what makes an expert witness. In Minnesota, I follow under the category called specialized knowledge, that if you're an advocate in Minnesota that has specialized knowledge, meaning a lot of experience, you've done a lot of trainings and such, you can be an expert witness in the state of Minnesota. So mostly I've testified for prosecutors, but I've also testified for a number of defense cases where women have been on trial for either attempted murder or murder of their abusers. So I've done that a couple of times as well, where the defense is trying to make a case of self-defense. And so that's happening kind of more and more. But I don't know anything about the case when I get asked to come. All I know is if it's an adult case, if it's a heterosexual couple, and if there's children, because that's my area of expertise, is in intimate partner heterosexual cases, and there's children between the man and the woman in the case. And so Recently, I got asked to testify in a case, and it was related to Allison, for why Allison was here. I didn't know Allison at the case, so a lot of times what happens is one of the questions I get is, do you know the victim? They say their name. In this case, it was Allison. Do you know the defendant? They say the defendant's name, and I don't. And so what I'm providing is expertise, and they're asking me questions, not just about physical violence, but to help the jury. So that it's like a training or a presentation, and the jury is the audience, essentially. And we're trying to help the jury understand what it's like to be a victim and why victims make the decisions they do. In Allison's case in particular, and she'll say a little bit more about this, I remember a couple of the questions that were asked. And I just want to say also that it's not a situation always where there's sort of this terminology, victims who recant, right? That's why a lot of experts come in. I testify in a lot of cases where the victims, do testify, and but I still help to explain some things. So in Allison's case, she had been married for 25 years. And during her police statement, she had indicated that she still loved her husband. And the prosecutor knew that this would be something difficult for the jury to understand. And so I testified about why that would be and about the complexity of that. And so to help relay that to the jury. But I also testify a lot about why victims don't call the police. Maybe why the delay in a report. So maybe why they'll hesitate to call, why they don't call the police all the time. Of course, why they stay in relationships. So I testify a lot in that regard. And so we get, Scott Miller and I get quite a few subpoenas, but we don't get many cases where we actually testify. Most cases of domestic assault in Minnesota don't go to trial. But what we have found out as a legal strategy is that prosecutors have said that in many cases, what's happened is they found that the defendants will take a better plea because there's the threat per se of having an expert witness. So anecdotally, we've been told that. So for example, in Stearns County and a couple other counties now, they're putting experts on every single case. And so they're kind of submitting that as a witness, and they found that as a helpful sort of strategy to get better pleas going forward. So we'll let Allison say a little bit more, and maybe she and I will have a little bit of a conversation, but I don't want to say too much about Allison's experience. I want her to be able to say it for herself.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yeah, I think it's helpful for all of us to understand that the expert witness bridges the gap, I think, between the court, the jury, and the victim. So thank you so much for showing up in court and making sure that survivors' experiences are understood in that way. And as we discuss understanding survivors' experience, I just want to say thank you so much for being here, Allison, and being willing to share your experience as a survivor of violence with us, and someone who's still actively involved with your case and the justice system. One of the things we know is that the system often treats survivors' needs and concerns inconsistently. And in your case, the prosecutor understood some of the nuances of the things we're talking about today, and there were at times you felt supported and times you didn't. So could you talk a little bit more about that experience and what you think is important for people to take away from this discussion about women's experiences reporting violence or going to court?
Well, maybe I should talk a little bit first about what I am a survivor of domestic violence and my story, because my story is very important, and I really want to share it because I want others to know that they're not alone, and to also find the courage and their voice to make a better life for themselves. I was married for 25 years, and my ex-husband and I had 5 children together, and we had a pretty good marriage for the most part, nothing different than any other marriage. And until about 4 or 5 years ago, where things started to change and our marriage started to decline. And nobody on the outside of our home really knew. I kept it to myself. And I think a lot of it, like what Alessandra was saying, with the economic status or with kids involved or the value of marriage. And that's why it was important for me to continue to stay and continue to work on what I had started 20 years ago. But a year and a half ago, on one fatal night. My ex-husband did get upset about an instance, and he grabbed me and he threw me up against the cupboards, and then he slammed me down on the floor. And as he slammed me down on the floor, he grabbed a knife from the kitchen and began to stab me. I was stabbed on my hands, my arms, across my chest, and my face. My kids were involved. We had 3 kids in the home. They were all involved in the situation and came to my rescue, helping me, and also calling 911. First responders were at my home within 3 minutes. And I really want to give credit to that. And they're helping me and saving me and getting, the what I needed. Now, it wasn't always that case. Now, previously, the police had been called to my home several times for domestic, and walked away, or didn't always listen, or didn't always believe in what was happening because of the fear that I was going through, or the judgment that we were going through, or the protection of what I was wanting for my family. So, but this night was different, and I was taken to the hospital, and my ex-husband was taken to jail. And through the past 1.5 years, I've been in and out of the courts. I've been in and out of just a lot of different legal proceedings, not knowing really what I'm doing or understanding it. But the prosecutors, who are very warm and compassionate and helpful, really heard me out. So, in all of our different meetings, like you had said, Nasifa, they're just trying to understand where I'm coming from and understanding the whole bigger picture of everything. So they had been in other trials and they had been in other situations, but mine was different. And so they had to hear me out, and they had to hear where I was coming from. And at times, there was times where I didn't feel like I was being heard, just because it was unknown and unfamiliar territory for me. I also had a social worker who was also really helpful too. And she helped me through a lot of it, and she helped me with the kids and whatnot too.
Allison, do you want to talk a little bit about the court experience, about actually going to court, and about testifying, kind of related to what Alessandra was talking about, and then kind of your response about some of the things I testified about, but talk about actually being in court and actually testifying and what that was like.
Okay, well, and my ex-husband did not take the plea deal. So he wanted to take it to trial, and then we had trial it was almost a year and a few months later after the incident. So that year of it just being prolonged and kind of lingering was a lot for me and the kids to have to deal with and go through, because, well, let me backtrack. My kids also had to testify in court because they were witnesses at the crime, or at the scene, excuse me. So my kids and myself all had this like lingering for a little over a year of waiting for this trial to happen. My ex-husband had requested a non-speedy trial every time that it was scheduled, which meant that he kind of got bumped, I guess, for other cases that came through. So then it was like, we get that adrenaline, or that excitement that it's really going to happen this time, and then it gets canceled, and then we have to wait again. And then when it did finally happen at trial, I was told that he was pleading self-defense, but I had no idea how or why or what was going to take place when I took the stand until I took the stand. And so I think that was really, really frustrating for me because I didn't know what to expect. And the story that he had created in his mind really took me by surprise. But then also, you know, his lawyers just drilling it and drilling it and drilling it and asking me over and over and over again, you know, and I understand, you know, they were trying to break me or whatever, but the story was false. So I had to be strong. And I also had to relive and retell my story. And my kids had to do the same.
Yeah. So, Allison, can you say a little bit about, you know, about the preparation for testifying, about did you have preparation for testifying and what that was like? And did you see the courtroom or any of those sorts of things?
Yeah. You know, they did a really good job. We met several times and we did prepare. But from my knowledge, the prosecutors didn't even know what his story was.
What his defense was, right? What his defense was.
Exactly. We all knew that he was pleading self-defense, but we didn't know what he was going to say until we all got there.
Right. Like based on what, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about the impact of this on your children for us, Allison?
Mm-hmm. Well, like
the testifying part and what that was like.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and not even just the testifying, you know, this is their father. This was the man, you know, that helped me raise all of our kids. And it wasn't always bad, you know, so it was really hard on all 5 of them. But they had also started seeing some different signs and some red flags through, you know, the decline of our marriage as well. But so my 3 kids that did have to testify were 18, 17, and 9. And my 18-year-old is very strong. And she felt very prepared and ready to testify. The unfortunate part for her was she was also trying to be a freshman in college through this, which was difficult for her. And it was a relief for her to get it done. And when she had testified at trial, I remember her saying, finally, she doesn't have to talk about it anymore unless she wants to. So that was a big impact on all of us because now it's her choice to have to talk about it if she chooses and not more or less forced during a court trial. My 17-year-old son, he's really laid back and kind of easygoing, and he knew what he needed to do, and that was to get up on the stand and tell the truth and then walk away. I was mostly worried about my 9-year-old because I was worried having him see his dad in person after not seeing him for a year and a half, how he was going to handle that. I couldn't be in the courtroom. So I just was listening to what other people told me afterwards that he did very well. You know, he also said what he needed to say and then he walked out.
Yeah. And Allison, did they tell you that they were going to use an expert witness ahead of time? This is something I guess I haven't asked you. And what did you think about that? Were you wondering why that had to be, or?
No, they did tell me that they wanted an expert witness, and I was also told that his lawyers tried to get that removed. And then they did, yes, also explain to me the importance of having an expert witness. And after trial, when it was all done and said, I had a lot of my family and friends that were in trial every day that whole week, just really telling me how amazing the expert witness, Melissa, was, and just so many of the facts that I was living through, that I was going through. that you knew and that you were able to share and really let the jury know and have a better understanding.
Yeah. And just to clarify is that I didn't know any of those details. I think what happened is I happened to explain things in close relation to how it actually happened to you is I think part of what happened. And Allison, I remember seeing I remember seeing family in the audience, and I remember seeing a lot of heads nodding, and I remember seeing some tears. Yeah, when I was testifying. Yeah.
Through all of this, I've had amazing support from family, friends, my church group. So I've been very fortunate that I've had the support.
Yeah. Alessandra, what do you hear about when you sort of hear Allison talk, and what sort of things are you thinking about Alessandra?
Thank you very much, Alison, for your words. And your words are so strong and powerful, and it's always difficult to comment on a first-hand personal experience. I always feel inadequate. But well, just a few words, because I don't want to steal time for other comments and questions. And I really think that your testimony is very precious, because what I found talking to women who suffered violence from their partners is the feeling of strangeness and peculiarity of their experience, not only during trial, but in general. So the experience of domestic violence, we may say, is always an exceptional experience, even if it's very common, and is always an experience of strangeness. And so to share this awareness makes women survivors more comfortable, I believe, with themselves and with others. So it takes a huge weight off their shoulders, I believe. So thank you very much for your words, and I stop here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also a little bit curious, how you are now, Allison, and would you mind sharing with the audience? I know that you've talked about that you've had some permanent injury from it. So can you say a little bit about that, and just overall how you're doing?
Yes, I do unfortunately have some permanent injury. I don't have much hand or arm strength in my left hand, and the side of my face is numb. But I am still blessed and grateful because I am alive and I'm able to share my story. But I'm working through a lot of that. I don't have to seek physical therapy anymore, so that's a good sign. And me and the kids we're doing well. Yeah, we're doing well.
Yeah, good. Allison had reached out to me actually on Facebook that after I testified, I didn't even know who Allison was before, and she reached out. So I've gotten to know Allison now. So it's great just to see how you're doing and how your kids are doing. Your son became homecoming king, I think, right? In St. Cloud. So I know that was a big highlight for you recently, and doing something.
I am very fortunate. I have 5 of the most amazing kids ever. Yeah. And they're actually my biggest supporters. And I will admit that probably the first 6 months after this tragic incident, I was at a point where I almost was tempted to call them and say, I'm okay, you can stop calling me every half hour. Because there is a lot of love in our home, and my kids are great, and they love me and they check on me often, and they're successful as well. They're doing great things. So
I just want to echo what I'm also reading in the chat from everyone. We are so grateful to you, Allison, Alessandra, Melissa. I feel like this has been such a powerful discussion, and I know we're all honored to be in this space together. I think a major takeaway that we can all carry forward with us is that we have to really challenge the thinking of society. We have to change the way we advocate for safety, and we need to be putting accountability on those who are causing harm rather than forcing survivors to take responsibility for being victimized. And so once again, thank you all so much. I want to be cognizant of time here. So I'm going to lean on my colleague, Sophia, who's been monitoring the chat through the entirety of the webinar. Sophia, do we have any questions in the chat? to pose to the panelists?
Yeah, there's been so many great questions. So thank you all for entering them into the chat. You can continue to do so as well. I did see one question in the chat, I think from someone who works in this field. They said, how do we get the criminal justice system on board with training? Alessandra mentioned magistrates, everyone needing training, not just social workers. How do we do so in a way where they're not offended or they're open-minded to it? They said there's often pushback from these people because they think they're already educated or trained in this area. I don't know if Alessandra or Melissa, go for it.
Yeah, I've been asked to testify a number of times, and there's only been a couple times I haven't. And the reason why is I remember one time a judge had made a ruling. I know enough about this. I don't need an expert. And the domestic violence agencies have done a fine job educating the community, and the jurors will be just finely educated. And so there is some resistance for sure. And there's also this sense of, having done a lot of judges training about coming into it, wanting to be sort of neutral all the time and, thinking they're hearing a biased sort of explanation of things. So that most certainly has been a challenge as well. But I would say the other thing is that we hope even beyond training that we can work to organize the rest of the system so that when the judges get the information that they get, that it's in a way that doesn't account, for example, just for Allison's incident that she experienced, but the breadth of her relationship, right? And everything that's happened up to that day. So that's also what we hope to do with judges, as well as to make sure that they have all the information besides just the incident. Alessandra, do you want to say anything about that?
Just a few words. Yes, there is resistance. I agree with you. And but in Italy, as much as I know, there is sometimes a sort of enthusiastic reaction to these trainings, because sometimes they really realize that there were so many things that they didn't take into account. So at the end of the training, sometimes they really thank the people who have been working on that. So I think this, it's a challenge, but I think it's very important.
I do have another question. We've gotten a fair amount of questions along these lines in the chat, which I think is a really important one to ask, and is more directed towards you, Allison, about how can we support our friends and family members throughout the process, maybe before, during, and after going through the justice in the court systems.
Well, like I said, I kept a lot of it to myself and within my home. I didn't take it to any of my friends. But I know that some of my friends noticed red flags. I think, I know that some of my friends noticed things were different or things were changing. So I would say that as a friend, or a coworker, or, somebody that knows somebody, that if you start to notice those red flags, just be there and let them know that they're not alone, or that there's resources, maybe helping them find those resources, and not giving up on them.
Thank you. I think we do have one more time. We have time for one more question. One that I was also curious about too, but does the patriarchy play a role in how women are treated in the courts, especially maybe relating to credibility?
Well, yes, of course. That's I would say the Alessandra and I are smiling because that's the big, right, sort of mechanism that holds this all together. And I think that in part, the way it plays out is in the thinking, right? So a judge who thinks, well, why didn't she just call the police, right? This thinking that we're all positioned in the society with the same resources, right? The same knowledge, the same access, when that's just not the case. And, in a social structure where the patriarchy, has most of the control and the thinking, it definitely has a big impact on this. Alessandra?
Yes, of course, and all those questions that recur during the trials. For example, why didn't you leave him? Do you still love him? And could you please explain why did it something to you, and etc. These are all within this frame, of course. So I believe that there is a lot of work to do on that for sure.
Yeah, I think it's also tied to, who has access to be a judge, for example, who has, the resources, the really, not everybody believes they can be a part of it. And that's in part what the patriarchy wants, is they want it to be, a certain type of person who's in that position for sure.
I think that it's also important to know the background story too. This was my husband of 25 years, and it wasn't always like this. This just started happening the last few years. So I didn't want to leave, or I didn't want, to end the marriage, because there was a back history of memories and a life that we had built together. And I'd always hoped that change was going to come, or that things were going to go back to the way that they were. And so I was holding on to something that just wasn't there anymore. But unfortunately, now I know. But I think that knowing the backstory of, what women are going through, or where their life is at, is important too.
Yeah, I appreciate you all so much. I think the questions and the answers here today have been so insightful and thought-provoking. And so I just want to thank our guests for talking to us today. And I also want to thank our participants for being here. I'd also really like to thank my colleague, Sophia Morissette, for ensuring that this conversation went smoothly on the question side and the tech side as well. We've also included links in the chat to learn more. So if you'd like to support Global Rights for Women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe, centering survivors' voices as the means to achieving systemic change. You'll also receive an email in the next few days with resources, as well as a link to the recording so you can view it later. Once again, thank you all so much for being here. And it was an absolute honor to share this space with you all. Thank you.